Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade. And we're up to Symphony number 59. This one has a nickname, the Fire Symphony. Nobody knows why it's called that, and it has nothing to do with how the music sounds. This is actually one of Haydn's more gracious and kind of almost relaxed. Haydn's never really relaxed. I mean, he's always got energy, but this symphony does something very interesting by way of changing the dynamics of the way the energy usually flows. And we're going to get to that in a minute. But right now, why is it called the Fire Symphony? Well, some people have speculated, well, because it's really fiery. Well, it isn't, as I just said. It's very gracious and elegant and charming. It may have been used, or some of it may have been used, as incidental music to a play called Die Feuerbrunst. That's a possibility, because a lot of Haydn symphonies and symphonies in those days were used as overtures. I mean, they were called, actually. Symphonies were called Symphonia by Haydn, but, like in the UK, when Haydn was doing his London symphonies, they were called overtures. Symphonies were overtures. The opening of an opera was the Sinfonia. So you could use multi-movement pieces as overtures or incidental music in plays, and there is a contemporary manuscript, apparently, or some manuscript, that says Feuer Symphonie or something like that in Deutsch. So that suggests that it had some other use or purpose. It has nothing to do with how the music sounds. So let's forget about that right now. And banish that concept. Now, this symphony teaches us a very, very interesting lesson, I mean, in the usual incredibly engaging way, because it actually dates from probably, I mean, we don't really know with, Haydn, because most of the manuscripts are lost, but probably around the 1760s, which means it's an early symphony or a middle early symphony. It's one of his earlier ones, but it's numbered, number 59, with works that were composed much later. For example, number 60, the Distracted, Il Distratto, which we're going to deal with next, and which really was used as incidental music to a play, that's from the mid-1770s. So this is the 1760s. But the lesson that it teaches us is that it doesn't matter. It's not that we don't know that it's an earlier work. We know it's an earlier work more because of size, because it has very concise movements. And so it's not one of the longer ones, and by the treatment of the wind instruments and things. So, there are little clues that indicate that it probably belongs with those earlier works from the 1760s. But from the musical point of view, from the point of view of musical sophistication, Haydn was always firing on all cylinders from the very first symphony on. He really was. I mean, we've said that from the beginning, but this is particularly true, and you hear it here with great specificity. And I am going to, I've got, 7 musical examples, including a bunch of comparisons and things, that will really drive that home. And I think it'll be very, very interesting for you to hear. So let's start with the exposition from the first movement. That's what we're going to hear in these performances with the Austro-Hungarian Haydn Orchestra under Adam Fischer on Nimbus. And here it's Brilliant Classics. They licensed it, but very good performance of this particular symphony. It's a zippy, peppy symphony initially. And the thing to keep in mind with this, the way the first subject goes in any case, is the way in which it begins with a bang, and then slowly becomes more relaxed. So instead of increasing in energy as the music goes on, the first subject at least, I mean, it regains its zip later on. The first subject is a decrescendo from fiery opening, there you go, to a more relaxed, mellow cadence. And then it starts up again and goes buzzing along, and you'll hear how that operates. But remember that opening. Haydn wants you to remember it. He wants you to remember it for a long time. So he repeats it in the exposition quite frequently. The important thing is the opening octave drop. Yam-bom. It's like that. I mean, it has this constant you keep hearing that over and over and over, and you will hear why anon. Anyway, let's start with the opening, just the exposition. We don't need to hear the whole movement because you can do it yourself. You're ready? On your mark, get set, go. Lovely, charming. It has a real second subject. It's airy and delicious, and then the exposition ends also softly. And one thing you will notice, and it's actually rather interesting in this particular symphony, is that all three, the first three movements, all of them end quietly, which is quite unusual, really, for a work of this time. You don't usually find, it's so unusual, let's put it this way, that it has to be deliberate. I mean, Haydn's doing it for a reason. He really is. There's this tendency toward gentleness, increasing gentleness and calm at the end of each of the three movements, and the first three movements. And yes, Haydn wants to do that, which is just the opposite of like fiery. So yeah, I mean, to hell with that. So the first movement begins with that idea, and keep it in mind. Just keep it in mind. And we'll talk about it again later. Now, the first movement is in common time, 4/4. It's in duple meter. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, like that, right? The two inner movements are both, which is very unusual, also in 3/4. And like I said, just the fact that I keep saying it's unusual, but my point is, even in his early symphonies, Haydn is doing wonderful things, experimental, questing, fascinating things. I mean, we've talked about the previous 58, so that's happening, right? But even though this one really sort of belongs more in the 30s, if they had been numbered correctly, it is of such musical subtlety and sophistication that it encouraged whoever was cataloging these things, Eusebius Mandachevsky or someone like that, to stick it with the much later ones. And it, from a musical, just quantity of musical interest thing, it works just as well, earlier as late. It's really quite astonishing. And that's why I keep saying you cannot second guess Haydn. You cannot judge him as having started with some sort of primitive, didn't know what he was doing, and gradually figuring it out. No, he always knew what he was doing. Always. Now, the two inner movements are both in 3/4 time, in triple meter. And that means that they sound similar. They sound kind of similar. 1, 2, 3, 1, because the minuet's not very fast. And the second movement, which is an andante, is not terribly slow. First movement is a presto. It's quite zippy. So there's that rhythmic relationship, but it's much more than that. It's a thematic relationship too. And this is where things get really, really interesting. I mean, really, totally, fascinatingly cool, interesting, because Haydn not only uses the same rhythm in the minuet as in the slow movement, but he develops or varies the themes of the slow movement to create the minuet. So they are related like this. And when you hear the minuet, it sounds almost as if it's simply a variation on the opening of the slow movement. And it gets even more fascinating from there. So what I've done here is I have an example where we have the first subject of the minuet, and I compare it, because we really need to do these things together, with the opening of the minuet. So you can hear the first subject of the slow movement, there's like a half a second pause, and then the opening of the minuet. And it's really, really cool because it's the same tune, basically. I mean, one is a variation. It doesn't go exactly the same way, of course, but the opening, bum, 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 ba-dum, ba-dum, like that sort of thing, you hear it very clearly both. So let's listen to the opening, the first subject. It's a sonata form movement with two themes. The slow movement, the opening of the slow movement, the first idea or subject, and then the opening of the minuet. And boy, will you be able to hear the identity of ideas there. Here they are. There, very clear. It's sort of, sorry, there's like a reflection when I do that, but I'll try to stop it. Anyway, it's really, really clear that we're dealing with the same thematic material. And, this means that the entire symphony was somehow conceived as a unit. That, there are relationships, which means that these pieces have to be together. You can't just, the argument that, well, it was incidental music that he wrote. Well, it's a little bit hard to make that case when there's so much cohesion between the individual movements, however different they may sound. So that's the first subject of the slow movement and the first subject of the minuet. However, the plot thickens. Oh, yes, it gets even more interesting. First of all, the second subject of this slow movement is just gorgeous. Oh, God, it's beautiful. It's so beautiful. And it's beautiful in a way that is really special to Haydn. One of the differences between Haydn and Mozart is that Mozart writes these gorgeous, long-breathed lyrical melodies. Haydn is a much more concise composer. And he achieves this sort of melodic fullness in a very, very different way. And this example is a particularly good one because it starts out as though it wants to be a big, gorgeous lyrical melody. But this is being Haydn. It immediately starts to break up into little bits. And this, remember, is a process that's similar to what we heard at the very beginning of the symphony. That is the theme that sort of peters out as it goes. And that's what happens to this. However, it recaptures its lyricism as it goes. There are some interruptions and some surprising little things, but then it starts to increase in lyrical elegance, and Haydn emphasizes this with a harmonic progression that is so luscious and voluptuous and romantic. It starts to have this rolling kind of perpetual motion. And listen to the harmony in that passage. It's so, so beautiful. And Haydn does more with that to give it that kind of romantic depth, but in a very small space. I mean, that's how he worked. Because when it returns, this entire movement has been scored just for strings, with nothing else. The whole symphony is for strings, two oboes, two horns, maybe a bassoon on the bottom, a harpsichord if you use one, which I don't recommend. And, that's it. But the whole woodwind section comes in when that second subject comes back. And they haven't done anything for the rest of the movement. And it's breathtaking. It's just breathtaking. It's amazing how with this tiny little orchestra that Haydn's using, how fulsome and rich and big the sound is, just by adding those four instruments, the two oboes and the two bassoons. And there's more. There's even more, because that beautiful passage with the ya da 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 da, it's rolling along with the beautiful romantic harmonies. Well, that becomes the middle section, the trio of the minuet, which is just like, oh, it's so amazing. It gives me like chills. It really does. I mean, it's such a thrill to be able to hear this and to be able to appreciate the incredible just intelligence and behind it all. It just blows me away every time I hear it. So here's the way this example works. You've got three chunks of music. You have first the second subject as it initially appears, just with strings. Then you hear it again as it returns with the woodwinds in the home key. You'll hear it's in a different key when it comes back. And then after that, we hear the trio of the minuet, which is particularly good in this example because Fischer does something that drives me crazy. He uses solo strings for the trio of the minuet, which he usually does in these things. And there's no justification for it whatsoever. And it particularly messes it up when Haydn actually asks for solo strings, as he sometimes does in these trios. But that's okay, because here you'll hear the change in texture particularly well, which is great. But you'll notice that the idea, the rhythm, and that rolling, continuous music, it's the same thing. Yes, it is. And it's so bloody cool. The tune is a variation. It's not exactly the same. But the idea is the same. The rhythm is the same. And so you hear the identity right away. And it's when you hear the whole symphony, of course, you're not hearing these things in close proximity to each other. And so when it comes back as the trio of the minuet, it just has this extra depth because it sounds like a memory of something you've just heard. And you may not recognize it. You may not realize, oh, it was that most beautiful romantic moment in the slow movement. And here it is reimagined. It's a little spookier and a little more desolate now. But you know it. And that gives what is usually a throwaway episode, the middle section of the minuet, which is the part that most people don't even think about twice. Other composers couldn't care less about the middle sections of their minuet. They just want something appropriately dancey, that'll be gone in 30 or 45 seconds. But with Haydn, everything matters. It's all part of the master plan. And that's what makes it so cool. So, as I said, we're going to hear the second subject for strings only, then its return with the woodwinds, that gorgeous, gorgeous woodwinds additions, and then the trio of the minuet. And you'll realize it's just one long, extended idea. And that's what geniuses do. So, here it is. lovely, isn't it? Just lovely. Now, we've had two movements, and the first movement, the ending of the first movement was quiet, and you actually heard it because it's exactly the same as the end of the exposition. So that sample from the first movement gives you the ending of the first movement. The second movement, being a slow movement, mostly quiet, ends quietly. Haydn does a lot of loud endings of slow movements too, actually, for various reasons. But in this case, it ends softly. And I'm going to play you now just the first section, the A section of the minuet, which is also ends with what is the same thing as the ending of the minuet, just to hear how that also ends quietly. And so you hear that he's starting to build up this expectation that everything about this symphony is going to be soft and gentle at the conclusion. Here is the first section. Well, actually, it's the return. Yeah, it's the return of the minuet after the trio. So you get to hear the whole minuet with the appropriate ending at the very end. That's actually better. So here it is. So we're getting softer and softer and softer 3 times. Then we get to the finale. Now, the finale is, oh gosh, it's so nifty. It really is. It begins with a horn call, as Haydn would also later do in the drum roll symphony, number 103. It's a different horn call, but it's a horn call. Here you have a horn call and a response from the oboes. And it's wonderful hearing that stuff. Instead of the usual string thing, it's like da da da, and the oboes go da 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 do 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 da 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 da. It's delicious, delicious. But Haydn has another trick up his sleeve, because not only do we get this wonderful vivacious opening, which is rather in the mood, the spirit of the first movement, because it's an allegro. It's allegro molto, actually. It's very quick, and it's in cut time, which is 2/2 as opposed to 4/4, but it's double time, as with the first movement. And the coolest thing is that the theme of that first movement, jump, remember that from the first movement? Yeah, you want to remember it? Do you remember it? Well, you're going to, because it comes back. It comes back in the finale. Oh my God, but not as an actual main subject. It comes back as motion music, as transitional material. And that is just beyond wonderful, because that means the finale has its own themes, but it also incorporates, summarizes the whole sort of symphony by bringing in material from the first movement. And it does this in a very concise movement. It's only 2 and a bit minutes long, the whole thing. It really is. So let's do it this way. Let's listen to the exposition, the whole exposition of the finale. And it's about 45 seconds long. Listen and see if you hear the bit with the first movement in it. I mean, the theme of the first movement. See if you notice it when it pops up. So here we go. Did you hear the bit that had the first movement thing? Well, in case you didn't, I have another little example here where we do both of them. First, the opening of the symphony. There's that first theme with the dying fall, and then the way that it occurs in the finale. And again, it doesn't end quietly. It continues. And the energy just continues because this is the motion music, the transitional material between the first and the second themes. And so Haydn wants to keep it moving. So he doesn't make it a rounded, complete statement. It's simply an episode that's in the course of our moving from the first theme to the second theme. Here they are, one then the other, with a little half a second pause between them. Is that not cool? I mean, I know people say to me, oh, well, who cares? It's just a tune coming back and all that. But no, it matters. It matters in terms of our perception of the guiding hand, behind the entire piece. And what that does is it makes the feelings, the emotions, it makes them more intense. Because the more familiar something is, the more you recognize connections between things, the more you sense this overarching mental process, putting the whole piece together, the more comfortable you are with the music, and the more intense and vivid its emotional expression becomes. I mean, it's a fascinating psychological phenomenon, which I'm not really qualified to discuss in greater depth than that. But all I know is that when you hear that first subject come in the transition, and whether or not you recognize it immediately, you say to yourself, oh, wow, listen to that. And it just gives the music's already exciting, but it just gives you like a double lift. It's like an extra bang for your buck. It just gives you more of whatever you're feeling. You just get more of it. And that's what's so great about it. So the first subject is the horn thing, right? And then there's that charming little second theme we heard at the end. Da, 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 bum, 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 right? Okay. That goes. Then there's like a whole little tiny development section. And the recapitulation does not begin with that horn call. It begins with the strings alone, sort of suggesting it. And then we go through the whole rest of the whole thing, exposition to the end, and then the horn call finally comes back as it did at the beginning, but by way of a coda, as a way to wrap the whole thing up. And here is where the genius of Haydn's overarching plan really, the buzzards come home to roost. He really brings it home because you have the threat of another quiet ending. It begins with the horn call, and then all the instruments go back, back and forth, exchanging little questions and answers, getting softer and softer and softer. And you think that the symphony is going to end like every other movement in the symphony ended, softly. And so you get very familiar with that idea until at the very last second, Haydn ends the thing with two really loud chords for the full orchestra. Jump, jump, like that. And that's it. Haydn has toyed with our expectations and contradicted them in a way which gives the entire symphony, this finale, this overwhelming feeling of completion, of satisfaction, and of joy. I mean, a really happy ending, because he said, aha! No, it's not going to end in gentle, quiet, calm. It's going to end with a bang, because you've gotten to the end, and this is the actual ending, not just of the finale, but of the whole symphony, of a whole four-movement process, the entire big picture. And it really shows us, again, that Haydn, in my book on Haydn, I quote his biographer, who says that Haydn always conceived his works whole. Well, this is such a fabulous example of that, because there is nothing in this symphony that could really go into any other symphony. I mean, it's a completely, it's a totality, a fully realized musical organism. complete in every detail. And so here's the ending. And you got to hear the ending. It's just marvelous. It begins with the recapitulation, with the strings hinting at that opening on the horns, and then the final horn call and fake out, die away. Here you go. Yeah, hot stuff. It really is. It's just incredible. And this, and remember, from a symphony from the 1760s, from, you know, a period that was 20 years before it was what was considered to be the high classical period, the fulfillment of Viennese classicism, the ultimate whatever, you know, when Mozart got their hands on things and Beethoven did and all that. And it is wrong. It's not true. Haydn was doing it from the start. He really was. And this symphony is just an incredible example of that. There may be bigger, there may be deeper, there may be, you know, other symphonies that have other levels of, you know, additional levels of complexity and larger scope in terms of size and whatnot. But when it comes to musical sophistication and perfection of shape and form and expression, we are already there. And it's 1760 something. And we're there. And next, we're going to jump to the 1770s, to the distracted, and to Haydn taking a piece of genuine incidental music, that is theater music, music to be played, a film score, effectively. That's what it is. It's music to accompany action in a play or serve as a prelude or do something. And turn that into one of his most interesting and curious and funny, very funny symphonies in 6 movements. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, just bask in this charming, delightful, wonderfully winsome, occasionally emotionally deep, extraordinary piece of music. Just extraordinary. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me on the Haydn Symphony Crusade. Tell your friends. We need more crusaders. Let's go. I actually managed, now you'll notice, to get the shirt finally when I actually was doing a Haydn video. Usually I don't, coordinate any of this stuff, but I did. And so I hope to keep doing it. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.